Welcome to the next video in the Suggestion App course. This is a complete course where we'll build a .NET 6 Blazor Server application with MongoDB from the ground up. There are three things you need to know before we get started. First, this is part of a series, and this isn't the first video in the series. If you're just starting out, you should check out the playlist that's linked in the description to start from the first video in the series. Second, this course is actually a paid course. MongoDB sponsored it so you can put the videos on YouTube for free. Check out the link in the description to sign up for MongoDB Atlas for free to thank them if you haven't already. Third, you can also buy this course on imtimcorey.com. The link is in the description. Buying this course will get you all the lessons right away, the source code for each lesson, a certificate of completion, offline access, and more. It also helps sponsor more free content. The video will be the same as it is on YouTube, so feel free to watch the free version if you want to. Okay, let's jump into today's video. Note there may be more than one lesson in this video, since some lessons are short. Let's talk about the big pieces of our application, the parts of our application that are really just the big chunks that make up the application. Now, there's a lot of little glue stuff that goes on between these big chunks, but these are the big things that we have to understand and know in order to build our application. This is the logic of our application. We need to make sure that we understand the various parts and how it works together. Now, this is not the in-depth logic of every little step, but it is the big parts and how they work together. For instance, this is going to be a web application. So what I'm going to create on my notepad here, I'm going to create the list of the big things to think through or know how to use. And so the first one is Blazor Server. This is what I've chosen to be our web application type of choice. And the reason I did so is because Blazor Server gives us the best of both worlds. I have the ability to create a server-side application, which means it can talk directly to a database or through a class library to a database without having to worry about the security of the user being able to access that database illicitly. And so that's the benefit of a server-side language, is that all that work gets done on the server, and what the user sees is just HTML and CSS. So they don't have access to the C# code. They don't have access to any of the C# logic. They don't have access to any of those things that I want to keep protected. That's the beauty of a server-side language. Server-side languages include ASP.NET Core MVC, Razor Pages, and API is also a server-side language or server-side project type. But I also want to have the ability to interact with the screen, have the user feel like they're working with an application, not a web page that keeps reloading over and over again. So I want that client-side feel as well. Client-side applications might be things like an Angular app or React or Vue or Blazor Server. Blazor Server can act as a client-side application as well. So can Blazor WebAssembly. The difference between Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly is that Blazor Server is also a server-side language. It sits with one foot on each side. So I have the benefits of a server side with all my stuff protected and the client side with that rich user interface interactivity. So I have both. Whereas a Blazor WebAssembly project or an Angular, React, or Vue project, I have to have an API. And an API adds overhead and it adds complexity. And these are things that I don't want to add to this project. So Blazor Server will fit in the sweet spot of what I want. Now, my choice here is not the choice of every web application that I build. Let's be very clear here. This choice is based upon this application. That's it, this application. So when you say, hey, what's the best web project type? I'm going to say it depends. Now, in this particular situation, the best web project type is Blazor Server. For my skills and experience, for the stuff I may be building around it, for what it does as far as both client-side and server-side, it's the best choice for this application and this environment and this developer. But your choice may be different, and that's okay. That's what development's always all about, is having those choices and being able to make the right choice for your application. So that's the first big piece or big logical piece of our application is Blazor Server, which means it's a web-based project. Now, we need to talk about scalability before we go any further. There are two camps here when it comes to scalability. I want you to be in a third. One camp will say, hey, we don't need to worry about it as long as it works, it ships. And there are some good points in that side, in the fact that, yes, you need to get your application to work, because a working application that is okay beats a non-working application that might have great ideas. So, yes, you need a working application. And that is your first goal, is to make it working. But that does leave a little bit of a problem when it comes to deploying, because if your application becomes useful to someone or in any way successful, that could cause a problem because of scalability. Maybe it works in your dev environment, but it doesn't work once you get to 100 people or 1,000. Now, the other camp is the camp that says, hey, we need to make this application so scalable that if Google level traffic comes to it, meaning the most ever on the internet, it could still handle it. And no, we don't need to do that either, but there are some good points to that argument. And the points are that, hey, we don't want our application to crash once we get to production. We want to be able to handle large volumes of people. And yes, we do, but we need to make sure that we don't spend so much time optimizing for 10,000 users at a time that we forget about the fact that we'll never have 10,000 visitors at a time. Now, I have a very popular YouTube channel. I have literally hundreds of thousands of subscribers, and yet I'm not anticipating that I will have more than probably 50 to 100 people at any one time using my site, at least not after launch. Now, launch is always a bigger time, and we may have some performance issues because both we're getting lots of people all at once at the very beginning, and it's the very beginning, so we haven't worked out all the performance kinks in it yet. That's okay. I want to prepare for that. I want to do as much as possible to be ready for that. But at the same time, I realize that that won't be the normal. The normal is that I probably won't have more than 50 or 100 people at any given time on my site. That's just typical web traffic, even for a person who has a larger YouTube following and who's going to be pushing that whole YouTube following to come to this site. So when you're talking about your web application, be realistic in your expectations. You're not going to be, most likely, you're not going to be the next Amazon. You're not going to be the next Google. So you want to make sure that you hit the third camp, which I'm advocating for, not the camp that says, just get it out there, don't worry about performance, or the camp that says you must have infinite scalability. Hit in the middle where you say, hey, I want to prepare for scalability, but I want to focus on getting my application to work. So what that balance means is that we'll be building this application with the idea that it will be used and it may scale up over time. We want to be prepared for that in the fact that we don't want to work ourselves into a corner where it cannot scale after a certain point. But at the same time, we're not going to build it with scale immediately. We're not going to build it in such a way that at the very launch of it, we'll have 30 copies of it around the globe. But when we get to that point, we want to be able to move it out to 30 copies around the globe and be okay. So that's where the balance we're going to hit. And that's why you'll see some things in here where you say, wait a minute, I think that could be even more efficient. And yes, you're right. We could make some things more efficient. We're not going to yet, because the simplicity of what we're going to be doing is more important at the beginning. And then as we find the pain points, that's what will make it more complicated. Here's what I mean by that. If you make something really, really complicated, but it's really, really performant, and no one ever needs that performance, you kind of made your life miserable for nothing. But if you make a flexible application and you launch it to production and you find out, oh, we've got this bottleneck, maybe it wasn't the one you were expecting, but you can look at that bottleneck and go, oh, we can fix it this way, and maybe add some more complexity, but in the place where it's needed. And then you make your application more scalable. So we're not going to be overly concerned about scalability, but at the same time, we are going to keep it in our mind. So with that, let's talk about the other parts of the logic of this application, the other logical bits to this application. We've already talked about authentication and authorization. So what tool do we use for authentication and authorization? We could use the built-in identity server with the Blazor Server template. We're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to use Azure Active Directory B2C. This is a free-to-use tool for up to 50,000 users that are active monthly. So the way they determine this is if I log in once, I'm a monthly active user. If I log in 100 times, I am still one monthly active user. If you reach beyond the 50,000 in a month, then you pay for the additional users. And it's a small fee, it would not be that much. And then the next month, if you go down below the 50,000, you don't pay that next month, and so on. So we're going to use this for our authentication system because Microsoft handles it. Microsoft handles the scalability of it. Microsoft handles the security of it. Microsoft handles a lot of the heavy lifting for us, and all we do is point to it. So that's what we'll use for our authentication and authorization. Now, we need to make sure we understand how to use these two topics we talked about so far. So if you're not familiar with Blazor Server, I'd recommend you go watch my Blazor Server course or some Blazor Server videos and get up to speed with Blazor Server. If you have not worked with Azure Active Directory B2C, then I'd recommend that you look into that and you learn how to use it. I've got videos on YouTube and I've got a course on Azure Active Directory B2C. Get to know these topics because you don't want to be building something in production that you don't understand or don't know yet. So, and this is not an advertisement for go buy my other courses. When you're following along this course, that's fine. Just follow along and I'll teach you how to do it. But if you are building this in the real world, if you are actually building this application, you would need to learn these topics first. Again, ideally you would know these topics already, but you don't have to. You can just follow along and I will teach you as we go and you'll get most of it. And if you have to fill in the gaps, my other YouTube videos should fill in those gaps for you. But just note that in the real world, you should understand the topics before you start building a production application. Now, next up, let's talk a little bit about how we're going to store our data. And again, this comes back to scalability, ease of use, ease of scalability, and also just what's best for our data. Well, our data here is something that's a little bit flexible because notice we have, let's just think about a user for a minute. A user will create multiple suggestions. We need to know that. We need to link that user to those suggestions. A user is going to vote on multiple suggestions, and we need to track that the user has voted on those suggestions. So we need to track that and associate it with the user. So we have all these linkings going on where we need to have more information about what's going on, who did what, and how it's connected. So on a given suggestion, we'll have a number of people who have voted for that suggestion. So with a relational database, that's going to be a little bit tricky. We're going to have a number of tables that have to be joined in order to do this efficiently. But there's a better way to do this, or there's a more efficient way of doing it for this particular application. And that is that we're going to use a NoSQL database, meaning we're going to use a database that's designed to be a document database, one where we can store what sounds like duplicate data, but reality is not quite duplicate data, but we're going to store data in different ways with different objects. And that will be more efficient for the storage and retrieval, and it will allow us to also scale around the globe very, very easily. And so I use MongoDB. MongoDB is going to allow us to really scale up quickly when we need to, but at the same time, it's going to allow us to build something very, very efficiently. In fact, when we actually get to building this application, we're going to find that the database code is practically nothing. It's just, yeah, give us that stuff. Yeah, here's the stuff. That's all it's going to be. There's not going to be a lot of complicated, complex data going on in this application because of the fact that we chose a document database. If we had chosen a relational database, we'd have a lot more complexity to deal with. And there'd be a lot more focus on table structures and indexes and store procedures and making sure we have the right queries in place. We have quite a bit of a section to focus on our data design. For our data design, it's going to mostly focus on what data do we need on our screens. And then we'll store that data, and then we will retrieve that data when necessary. So that's our third big block. Now, after that, let's focus on the other bits where we have to think about efficiency. Now, again, not scalability to Google, but still scalability. The idea that what happens when 100 people hit this at once? Well, right now we have on this sample site 345 suggestions. How are we going to display that on the page? Do we have a next, like the page 1 of 50, kind of like what Google has done in the past? Or do we have an infinite scroll? Do we just put 345 on the page and just call that good? How do we do this? Well, I think what we do is we use some tools to help us make this easier. One tool is called the Virtualize tool. So this is part of Blazor, where it's a newer version. I believe it's version .NET 5 and beyond, I believe it is. Maybe it's .NET 6. I think it's 5, though. Virtualize allows us to lazy load images onto the page, lazy load objects onto the page. So we don't have to load everything all at once. So we can pull all the suggestions down, but only load, say, in this case, we have, I think, 6 on the page. We'd only show 6, we only load 6 onto the page, but we have all 345 in memory. And then when you scroll down, it would start creating those 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th ones as we need them and not before. And then the previous ones it start forgetting about. So that as we scroll through the list, there's only a few things actually being displayed and wired up and have all the expense that comes with the connections on a dynamic page like this page. So we need to understand the virtualized component. But then with that, we should also talk about the idea that loading 345 suggestions from the database, not great if everyone's doing it. If we have 100 people loading these suggestions from the database, now we've pulled down 34,500 records. Just, 100 times over the 345 suggestions. And that's if we only have 345 suggestions. What if we have 3,000 suggestions? So now we should think about how do we do that efficiently. And one of the things we need to talk about is some type of caching. And we're going to start in this course with memory caching, just in-memory caching. Now, as we progress, we can look at more complex ways of caching. This is where, again, we talk about the initial scalability and the long-term scalability. So the memory caching, that's simple. And that puts all your stuff in memory, but then you can cache it for all the different calls. But as we grow, maybe that's not ideal forever. And so we think about things like Redis, where we use a Redis cache for our data rather than keeping it just in memory. So that could be a scalability thing where as we grow the concept of our caching. But for right now, we start with the simplest cache because it is so simple. And then we are prepared for scale, but we're not adding the complexity of scale before we need it. So those are the big things that I see, the big different objects to work with. The idea that we have to understand Blazor Server, we have to understand our authentication, our database structure, and then a couple of different things to help with our scalability. Beyond that, there may be some things we think about. For example, we haven't talked about contacting the user. Maybe we email them when the status of their suggestion changes. We haven't talked about that because that's really not version 1. But I'd be putting that on a version 2 list. But as you look through the logic of this and the big pieces we need, we look at this and go, is there any other big piece we need to talk about when it comes to the technology or the various bits we need to bring in? And I don't think there is. So I think we're going to stop with those are the big things to think about in an application to make sure we understand and make sure we know how to use. Beyond that, it's just C#. And we should have a good foundation in C#. We should have a good understanding of how C# works. But after that, that's all our application is. It's just C# code, some HTML and CSS code, which we should also have. And that may be something we should at least specify here, is we should have a good understanding of HTML, CSS, and Bootstrap 5, because that's what Blazor Server is built upon, is Bootstrap 5. So we should at least understand those topics and know how to use them. And here's the kicker here, in a modern way. We're going to do a lot of advanced CSS techniques that if you haven't worked with CSS in, let's say, the past 5 years, you might not know about. So again, if this was something you'd be doing in production, and if you're focused on building a web application, I would go learn about web development in a modern way. My Foundation in Web Development course, that's what it teaches, is modern web development. Because again, I'm trying to prepare you for all the things you're going to need. This is not a sales pitch. This is about the fact that when you're looking at building something, you need to have the tools necessary to do the job. That's why I create the courses I do. I'm saying, hey, they're going to need this tool. Let's create it for them. They're going to need that tool. Let's create it for them. So that you can walk into a job like this and say, yeah, I can do that. Because when you break out the various pieces, you go, yep, I've done all those things. So let's go ahead and build this thing. And if you're not there yet, I would encourage you to practice, encourage you to learn so that you can get to that point so that when your boss comes to you with a project like this, you go, yeah, I've done that. And this course right here is going to help you do that because it's going to give you practice in building a production style application, but yet in a way that is low impact to you. If you mess this up, that's not a big deal. Now, if I messed this up, that would be a big deal because we're using this in production. But if you mess it up, it's a practice project. You can start over. So that's why we do practice projects, is to try stuff out, make sure we understand how the various pieces we've already learned fit together. And then how they interact and make sure we understand that in a real world way. So that's the logic design. That's the things that I would walk through as I was looking at the logic and the things I'd make sure that I'm prepared to do before I start writing code. Again, this is about saving ourselves from the bugs they will otherwise create.